largest signups that we've seen.
This meeting is being recorded.
Oh, just got a notification about the recording. So thanks again. Yeah, this is the largest one that we have seen, and really part of our mission is to bring the community closer to nature, and introduce you to amazing naturalists like Doug. So the fact that we have so many of you on here today is just really warming our hearts. We've been so excited watching the numbers grow. And yeah, we can't believe that this evening is here. We're going to get started by doing a land acknowledgement. After that, we are going to introduce our land trust, what we do, and what you can do to help support our efforts. Then I'll go over some housekeeping rules for your participation before handing it over to Doug. On this webinar, we have a whole bunch of people, but including our team at the Land Trust with Elaine and Serena helping us out. And we also have our CEO, Sue, on to watch, all joining virtually just like you. So even though the land acknowledgement I'm about to make has been carefully crafted, these words are not just here to be read. They really represent a moment of deep reflection, and you can even consider it a moment of silence while I speak. While I give this statement, I really hope that you listen to the words and it does inspire you to take action the way it's inspired us at the Land Trust to take action. I will get started reading it now. Aileen, are you able to put it up on the screen or start our slides? Perfect, thank you. We acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have had and continue to have a presence and deep connection with the lands on and near the Oak Ridges Moraine, a part of what is known to the Indigenous peoples of North America as Turtle Island. These lands are the meeting place of two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and those of the First Nations of the Williams Treaties. We would like to thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land with us. Understanding that we are gathering virtually today, we would like to give thanks for everyone representing where you are. Thank you for telling us where you are as well. If you do know one of the treaties or the territories that you are on, feel free to share them in the chat. Indigenous peoples have been subjected to colonial oppression and injustice, which continues to this day. And the Oak Ridges Moraine acknowledges that the first step to reconciliation is recognizing Indigenous peoples and their inherent rights to this land, which we ensure that we are creating a better future by strengthening our relationship to them and this land, which has been a mission for the Land Trust since it started. Our Land Trust endeavors to honor the land and its treaties by ensuring healthy ecosystems that thrive forever. Thank you. With that, I will hand it over to Aileen. I think you're on mute though, Aileen.
Can you guys see the sharing? I had some issues with my screens.
Yeah, it's up now.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so whenever we have a talk, I like to ask, who knows what a land trust is? And most people say no, they have no idea. And that's a sad thing because land trusts right across Canada and throughout the US do some fabulous things. We're a charitable organization. We can acquire land or interest in land, such as a conservation easement, and they're protected for conservation. We raise funds and we purchase land or we do the easements, and it protects ecological features and it protects it in perpetuity, or as our lawyer says, you can only say 999 years legally, but we like to say that it's protected forever. So we're taking direct action to protect land on the Moraine. We do ecologically significant land. We also do farmland, which is equally important. Right now, you may have seen that there's a lot of threats happening to our Moraine, and so the protection we provide adds added protection, and we like to say it's protection beyond legislation, so that land use can't be changed. And there's also significant tax benefits for landowners, so that's another bonus. Right now, we are protecting 5,073 acres of land on 66 properties, and that's right across the Moraine. It protects climate change resiliency, protects against it. We support species at risk habitat as well as general species at risk. We don't want them to get to be at risk or endangered. We like them to kind of be steady populations. And it helps preserve our biodiversity, which is going to be a big part of our talk today. and our natural and cultural heritage right across the Moraine. So why we do it? We envision that natural environments are important to sustaining and protecting life forever. So we believe that we need healthy ecosystems to survive. It's part of who we are, and it's part of what makes us healthy and keeps us healthy. We believe that other species need habitat just like we need homes, and that we want our future generations to experience nature and diversity and all the wonderful things that we love, that they get to experience that as well. So if you'd like to learn more about us, you can go to oakridgesmoraine.org. This is just a map showing rough locations of our properties that are protected right across the Moraine. So that's 160-kilometer long landform that's created. It's really important because it provides water for millions of people, both directly and indirectly, because it feeds all the streams that run down to the big lakes that we get our drinking water from. It's unique. I don't know if everyone saw the preamble slides, but it had all these features in it. Just on our properties alone, we have tallied over 1,600 different species. And that's just, I mean, there's so many more out there that we haven't cataloged yet. So it's home to a lot of biodiversity. It gives us water, it gives us green space to enjoy. And it's really good that we can protect that forever. We have some new exciting project happening, and I was telling Doug about this. If you haven't heard of the Kirtland's warbler, it was North America's rarest bird, songbird. There's different other birds, and sadly, that are also rare. It had a very particular breeding habitat, which was really common until colonial settlement and development across the land, and that the processes, which were natural or indigenous fires, were interrupted either by development, firefighting, or as part of the trying to get rid of that indigenous culture. And that was so important for the Kirtland's warbler and their breeding habitat, as well as a multitude of other species, which we're now seeing are at risk. So we started this restoration. It started down in the States where Doug was. They did some amazing stuff down in Michigan and Wisconsin, and were able to stabilize those populations. And they started to venture up this way, and they're looking for habitat up here. And the restoration project started, and this past summer, it was so exciting because 5 males, Kirtland warblers, showed up singing on habitat at a restoration site in Simcoe. So really exciting stuff, and we're looking to give them even more habitat. Not just these guys, there's a whole list of other species at risk that will benefit from this restoration, and it'll have a lot of native plants, which is part of our discussion today. Our goal is at least 125 native species established to create their habitat, but that's not our maximum. We won't stop there. We hope to stabilize populations in Canada and North America and bring back this lost habitat, which is a pine oak savanna. If you're interested in the project, if you want to volunteer, you want to donate towards it, you can email me direct at landtrust@oakridgesmoraine.org, which is on the screen. Or you can sign up at oakridgesmoraine.org/volunteer and just give a little note that you're specifically interested in the Kirtland's warbler. So we are doing lots of great things out on the landscape. Land Trust right across Canada, as I said, they're also doing great things in protecting these ecological gems, and it's protection that's beyond the reach of any local provincial legislation changes. So we're here to protect nature. I don't want to go too much longer because I know you guys are all here to hear Doug. We do have a couple other webinars coming up. The wetland one about human health. If you're into animal tracking, if you saw last year's one with Kim Cabrera, which was really popular, she's coming up again and doing advanced animal tracking. And then a closer look at bryophytes, which is the micro things, mosses, liverworts, hornworts, can't even say that right. All those interesting ground things that you see at the bottom of the forest, which make the forest, and they're integral to that ecosystem, adds that beautiful ambiance, if you will, while you walk through a forest. But when you start to look at it, these little micro ecosystems of life down there are so fascinating and interesting. They just gave them really dull and boring names. But we have a talk on that. So if you're interested in learning more, please join us for that. They're all free. Okay. So I think I've covered everything. That I've tried to go through that because I know you're all waiting to hear Doug. I'll turn it back over to Nikki.
Yeah. So again, I'll go quickly. Elaine talked about such amazing things with the projects that are coming up, the webinars that are coming up. So hopefully you get to hear more from us. Soon it'll be Doug. I'll just go over a few housekeeping guidelines. If you haven't seen it yet, there's a little Q&A button at the bottom toolbar. That's where we'll want you to put your questions because there's so many of you. If you put in the chat, it will likely get missed. We'll watch to see how those questions come in, and that way we can answer them either as they come in if they're for us, or we will save them to the end if they're for Doug, and we'll have a question period until after Doug's finishes presentation, until time is up. So there will be time for that. If you have questions throughout, put them in right away so you don't forget them. Now I will introduce Doug. I will keep it short, Doug, as I know you are humble and you can describe yourself, but he is the TA Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 111 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 41 years. He has a whole lot of experience and has authored many books, which you can follow up with after this. But without further ado, Doug, I'm gonna hand it over to you and mute myself.
Okay, thank you, Nikki. You did keep it short, and I am not going to describe myself. All right. So we have tonight, we have people from Winnipeg down to Belize, which makes it a big challenge for me. I've got to cover a subject that's relevant to just about everybody. The talk was advertised as something like me telling you how to make a pollinator garden. We're going to do that, but we're going to talk about more than that. As a matter of fact, there's this impression that pollinators are the only important insects out there. And I want to make sure that we don't leave this talk thinking that's true. They are extremely important, but so are other insects. They're all important. So we're going to talk about restoring the little things that run the world. And of course, that expression came from Edward L. Wilson, E.O. Wilson from Harvard. He died the day after Christmas in 2022. So it's been almost a year now. It's a terrible loss to the world of conservation. But way back in 1987, he wrote this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, our mammals, those food webs would collapse and all those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that right now rapidly turn over nutrients. But well, all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. So it was a somber message, but it was 1987 and nobody was really thinking about losing our insects. So it was largely ignored. And besides, if we're worried about losing our insects, why do we have National Insect Killing Week? Now that was 1929, but our general societal view of insects hasn't changed much. This was a campaign to boost the sales of all brands of chemicals to rid the community of insects. Notice it doesn't say pests, just all insects, they're all bad. And a lot of people still believe that. Well, even if we did succeed in killing all the insects in agriculture, where they're a challenge, and all the insects at home, where people don't like them, we still don't worry about losing insects because we think that they are common in our natural areas. A couple of reasons why that's not true anymore. And one of them is that we don't have enough natural areas to support those insects. We've turned those natural areas into our cities. And of course, they're not designed to support insects. We've turned them into our suburbs and they're not designed to support anything. Into our rural areas, they're not designed to support insects either. Agriculture, we got 770 million acres of rangeland just in the US. There's more if you add Canada onto that. That's 4.5 times larger than Texas. And those acres are not designed to support insects either. They're designed to support cattle, and they're typically overgrazed, which means not much is there. As a matter of fact, food production now claims just about half of terrestrial Earth. And of course, that is not designed to support insects either. The other reason that our insects are in trouble is that even the natural areas that we have in so many places, almost all the places, they have been invaded with plants from other continents. This is a natural area near me, White Clay Creek State Park. And I took this picture in March when all of the green you see is from Asia, because Asian plants leap out before plants from North America. So that's the load of invasive plants that a typical park has. It's usually more than a third of the vegetation is plants that is not supporting our insects. And that's what we want to talk about. Non-native plants destroy insect populations by replacing the natives on which those insects depend. And we have more than 3,300 species of non-native plants in our natural areas now. So what happens to, let's say, caterpillars when non-native plants replace natives? This is something we've measured in my lab. Very simple experiment, just took an undergraduate into hedgerows that were invaded or uninvaded. This is one invaded with autumn olive and multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and the typical invasives that we have around here. And we measured caterpillar populations in standardized ways and compared the caterpillar populations in hedgerows that were not invaded. So that was the trick, finding hedgerows that were not invaded. And we found a 68% reduction in the number of species of caterpillars in the invaded hedgerows, 91% reduction in the abundance of those caterpillars, and a 96% reduction in the biomass of those caterpillars and the amount of energy. So if you think of caterpillars as bird food, when you have an invasion like this, you've reduced bird food by 96%. And it's not just invasive plants that are reducing our insect populations. Many of the ornamentals that we have in our landscapes, and in the US, we have 135 million acres of residential landscapes. So plants like ginkgos, Ginkgo biloba from Asia, don't support any caterpillars either. And that's why we don't see what we used to see when well, at least when I was young, years ago. If you looked up at a headlight in the old days, that's what you saw. There were insects flying all around. If you drove your car, that's what the windshield looked like. And it was just common. We just accepted it. No more. We don't see that anymore. So we are winning our war against insects, even if it's an undeclared war. And that's why we're seeing headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. This was noticed first, really, probably with honeybees, and then followed up by looking at native bees, both in North America and in Europe. In North America, 50% of our Midwest native bees have disappeared from their historic ranges in the last century. We've got 4 species of bumblebees that have declined 96% in the last 20 years. So they're not gone, they're not extinct, but they're functionally extinct. They're no longer common enough to be performing their pollinating services. We got 3 species of bumblebee species that probably are extinct at this point, and 25% of our bumblebee species are at risk of extinction. In Europe, they're doing a little bit better job of measuring things than we are. 30% of Europe's orthopterans, the grasshoppers, katydids, and crickets, are facing extinction. Big study out of Germany suggests that 79% of flying insects have declined in Germany a 79% decline in flying insects since 1989. So a huge decline, almost 80% decline. 46 species of moths and butterflies have already disappeared from Germany. But this is the big one. Since 1974, the planet has lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 45% of its invertebrate populations, and that's mostly insects. And as insects decline, so do the birds that require them. So does everything that requires them. And a lot of things do eat insects. There are 432 species of North American birds that are now threatened with extinction. That's from the State of the Birds report. And it doesn't mean there's only 5 left of each one, but we learned from passenger pigeons and Alaskan curlews and other species that a measure of impending extinction is the rate of decline, even if they're still common in some areas. And we've got a lot of species that are declining very rapidly. As a matter of fact, there are 3 billion fewer breeding birds today than just 50 years ago. We went to the data set from Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds. And we divided those birds into the terrestrial species into 2 groups. The species that require insects at some point in their life history, typically when they're breeding, and species that don't require insects. So things like doves and finches and crossbills can actually reproduce on a milky substance that they make out of seeds, and they don't need insects to rear their young. And look, they didn't decline at all in the last 50 years. But the species that require insects declined on average 10 million individuals per species. It doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly does suggest that as you take insects away, you lose the birds that require them. What's happened in England is amazing. 2 invasive species, the English sparrow, which is really a finch, and the starling came from England. England has sterilized its landscape so much that both of these are now red listed in England. Very common around the rest of the world, but in trouble in England. And it's stats like that that make the UN report predict that there are 1 million species that are going to face extinction probably in the next 20 years. And they actually said that 2 years ago. So that's the next 18 years, I guess. And most of those species will be insects. So the question is, does this matter? Well, yes, it matters, because these are the creatures that keep us alive. If we worry about ourselves, we can be selfish about this. We need insects to run the ecosystems that we depend on. Now, what if I said, introduced plants are reducing your bank account by 96%, the way they reduce our insect populations? You would get it immediately that introduced plants are a problem. Well, insects are the currency in our ecological bank accounts. And it's our ecological bank account that keeps us alive. So we've got to pay attention to these statistics. They really do mean something over the long run. Our only viable option really is to live in harmony with the natural world that sustains us, to live sustainably with the natural world. And that world must include insects. And just a comment about that word sustainability, it's a word we can't compromise on. You can't be halfway sustainable. If you're halfway sustainable, you're unsustainable, and unsustainable is not an option. So we can't compromise on sustainable. We got to reach that level. And if it takes compromises in other sectors to become sustainable, that's what we have to do. So how are we going to do this? Well, we have to turn to private property, because most of the land where humans are is privately owned. 78% of the US is privately owned. 85% of the land east of the Mississippi is privately owned. So if we don't practice conservation on properties like this, we're going to fail. So how do we save insects at home? How do we save pollinators? How do we save caterpillars? How do we save all the insects in a landscape like this? That's the challenge. First, we have to think about what the causes of insect declines are. There are many. Dave Wagner says that insect declines, it's like death from 1,000 cuts. There's so many different reasons. We've got the misuse and overuse of pesticides, habitat loss. Of course, that's the big one. Every time you carve up an area and put a house there or something, that is definitely habitat loss. Plant choice, we'll talk about this. The plants we choose for our landscapes are going to determine what can live there, because all plants do not support insects equally. Many of those plants that we choose as ornaments escape and become invasive species. I think it's 85% of our woody invasive species are escapees from our garden. Light pollution kills insects. Climate change certainly kills insects. But there's actually good news here, because all of these causes are something that individuals, each one of us, can address easily, I should say. Climate change, tougher one. But if we all focus on this, we really can turn insect declines around. But if we're going to make insects, if we're going to create conditions that favor insect population growth, which one should we focus on? There are a lot of insects out there in the world. We've got 3 to 4 million species. It's a guess, because almost three-quarters of these are undescribed yet. I can still find undescribed species of moths in my yard without a lot of trouble. We've got about 164,000 species of insects that are described in the US, and we're not going to have them all in our yard. So which one should we focus on? Well, I think there's 2 groups that we can't do without. So let's focus on them. They're the groups that maintain plant diversity. Plants, of course, it's the first trophic level They're the organisms capturing energy from the sun and turning it into food. And that is the food that supports just about all animal life on the planet, including us. So we want to maintain that plant diversity. But we also want the insects that contribute the most energy to food webs. In other words, the insects that take energy from the plants and pass it on to other organisms. So I'm talking about pollinators, and I'm talking about caterpillars. We know about pollinators, we know less about caterpillars. We'll talk about each one of those groups. So let's start with pollinators. Let's start with why we need pollinators, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. You hear all the time that we need pollinators, particularly bees, because they pollinate 1/3 of our crops. Well, May Berenbaum at the University of Illinois took a look at that statistic and couldn't figure out where it came from. Her estimates are that they pollinate, based on the diets that we have, about 1/12 of our crops. And I hear people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. So I don't like that argument. It goes way beyond our crops. Pollinators are pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. So if we lose our pollinators, we're going to lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, and that is not an option. We are not talking about good land stewardship here. We're talking about essential land stewardship. Essential, something that absolutely has to happen. Okay, next, let's talk about what a pollinator is, where there's confusion here as well. There are a lot of insects that go to flowers. Most of them are not pollinators. A pollinator is something that actually transfers pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower. Sometimes it's in the same flower, sometimes it's on different flowers, sometimes it's on different plants. But that's what a pollinator does. All the other insects that are visiting flowers are taking advantage of the nutrition in flowers, either nectar or pollen, but not actually performing pollinator services. So we'll just call them broadly flower visitors. And maintaining a great diversity of flower visitors is fine, but we really do want to focus on the ones that are actively pollinating. So who are our major pollinators? Well, in North America, we've got one species of honeybee, introduced, of course, from Europe. Very important in many of our agricultural crops. We have just about 4,000 species of native bees that did just about all the pollination in North America before we brought the honeybee over. So yeah, these guys are good and they're capable of doing amazing work in terms of maintaining that plant diversity we talked about. But we also have about 14,000 species of moths and butterflies. 12,000 are described, another 2,000 need to be described. And many of these are providing pollinating services as well. And that doesn't get a lot of attention because most of the Lepidoptera pollinators are moths, and most of that pollination happens at night when nobody's watching. Okay, if bees are important, let's decide what a bee is. I tell people, well, you need to create habitats at home so that native bees can make a living in your yard. And they will say, well, no, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to get stung. And I say, oh, no, the native bees are not going to sting you. Most of them are solitary. They are not defending a hive. You can pet them. They're not going to sting you. And they say, oh, no, you're wrong. I just got stung last week. Well, what they really got stung by was not a bee. It probably, almost certainly was a yellow jacket, which is not a bee. It's a wasp. We got yellow jackets. We got paper wasps. We got bald-faced hornets, and they do sting. They are social wasps that are protecting their hives. So we're not talking about having large nests of these stingers in our yard. By the way, honeybees sting more people than anything. So we're talking about the native bees that are really quite harmless. And as I said, you can pet them while they're foraging, and they don't care. All right. How do we make pollinators? How do we increase their populations in our yards? Well, you have to give them what they need, which is pretty simple. They need a place to live and they need something to eat. So can we do that? I have to know where they live first. They live in 3 places. There are ground nesters, there are woody stem nesters, and there are pithy stem nesters. So let's look at each one of those. 70%, most of our native bees do nest in the ground. And what that means is they tunnel down. They dig a tunnel into the ground. This is a Calides bee. That's a female that has tunneled straight down. Then she has these little side shoots, and she packs them full of pollen and lays an egg on it. So she rears several young in a single tunnel. She's the only one in that tunnel. And they're afraid of you. As soon as a shadow falls over, she'll dive back into the into her hole, and she's certainly not going to bother you. But sometimes they can build up in numbers, and people see them flying all around the ground, and they get all upset. Totally harmless. This is a great picture from Heather Holm looking at pithy and woody stem nesters is doing the same thing. They hollow out the stem of something like a hydrangea or goldenrod, one of the dead stems that are out there in our fields, or in a woody stem that is easy to hollow out like elderberry, and they pack a section full of pollen, lay an egg on it, the egg hatches. This is what a bee larva looks like. Looks just like well, kind of looks like a maggot. I don't like that word, and it eats the pollen, and then she'll go down and she'll make another little cell here and lay another egg. So this guy's a little bit younger. This one's younger yet, and she'll just work her way right down. When these things mature and they pupate in these cells, then they tunnel out laterally through the stem. And these are the types of things we're talking about. So a lot of people ask, when can I mow down my field without hurting anything? And the answer is never. Because there are things that are living in there. But again, Heather has found that if you cut these stems off at maybe 12 inches, 15 inches, you can get rid of and do it in March, because there's a lot of seed up here that are particularly our overwintering sparrows and juncos depend on. So cut it off in March, maybe 15 inches up. Then the plants will grow up in the spring. And it is in these dead stalks that next summer's population of pithy stem nesters will nest. So it's a little bit complicated. You have to go an extra year, but the living plant tissue grows up past what you've cut off, and you can't see it, and it's not ugly. This is a elderberry branch where they have the different cells have already tunneled out. And when you see this, you know that you've successfully reared some woody stem nesters. But most people don't have woody stems or pithy stems in their yard. So we've discovered that, and that's the royal we we're talking about, can make bee hotels. So all of these cavity nesters will use bee hotels. You can make them that have different hole sizes in it, so you can support different species of bees. And it's, people get into it. It's fun. As a matter of fact, I think humans like bee hotels more than the bees do. Somebody really got into this one. There are problems, though. Research is showing that when you concentrate a whole bunch of nesting opportunities in one place, you're making it very easy for predators and for diseases to spread among our native bees. So it is much better to have tiny little unimpressive bee hotels that you scatter around your property. You want to protect them from rain, but in other words, you're not putting all your bee hotels into one basket, because that's what would happen in nature. You'd have coarse woody debris options all over your property. What do bees need to reproduce? They need pollen, and they need nectar, and they need it all the time. This is a distribution of native bee species in New England, and they are active from March all the way to November. And this is New England, so it's going to be very similar to southern Canada. Always a bee species around, which means you need to have flowering plants to service these guys, to provide the pollen and nectar that they need. Certainly early summer, late spring is when you have the most species, but a lot of species active all the time. And that becomes a challenge, because it is, particularly if you have a fairly small property. How do you have something blooming all the time? Remember, your property is attached to another one. This is a great chance for neighborhoods to cooperate. So you get a number of people interested in helping bees together, and make sure that you spread out the sequence of bloom across those areas, because native bees can forage good enough distances that they can reach those flowering plants, even if it's not all in your yard. All right, the next big challenge is the species of plants that we need for native bees. And this is where advice from Sam Droege comes in. He's from the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland. He says we should focus on meeting the needs of our specialist bees. We have about a third of our 4,000 species of native bees can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. If you plant those plants, the generalist bees, the ones that can use lots of plants, will use those plants as well. Why do bees specialize? Well, flowers actually have encouraged specialization. Flowers want their pollen to take it to another member of their species. They don't want it carried off by a generalist to another plant species where it's not going to do any good. So they've selected for specialized morphologies of pollen that will cling best to the hair structure of particular bees. There's different flowering phenologies. They look and they smell different from each other. The nutritional value of pollen differs a lot among species. They differ in amino acids and lipids. Some of them actually protect their pollen with secondary metabolic compounds that make them distasteful, except to the adapted bees. And they differ in proteins and starches and sterols. So this gives bees opportunities to specialize on plants so that you have a very tight mutualism between the pollinator and the plant itself. So, for example, you won't have Andrena facilii unless you have Facilia. That is the only plant that bee can reproduce on. You won't have Andrena asteroides without native asters. Specialize on asters. Andrena origine without spring beauties, and so on. Colides albescens on false indigo. A lot of specialists on particular plants, which means we need these particular plants or we lose these specialized species. So in general, depends on where you are, but in general, the best plant genera for native bee specialists typically are native asters, are perennial sunflowers. Goldenrods are always very high, evening primrose, willows, and so on. Now, this changes as you move around the country a little bit, but these guys are typically at the top. National Wildlife Federation has created a tool called Keystone Plants by Ecoregion that lists the best plants for specialist pollinators in your ecoregion. Now, right now it's at ecoregion level 1, it's too generalized. This is ecoregion level 1. But there are a lot of ecoregions. We're going to try to move this to level 2 so that it can be a little bit more specific. But you figure out what ecoregion you live in, look at that plant list, and it will tell you which plants are best for those specialist bees. And then, of course, we have a new book by Moraine Johnson and Shilia Kala just coming out, Garden for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee. But when you're gardening for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee, you're gardening for just about all the bees. A wonderful new resource, and it specializes on your region in southern Canada. So please check this out. As a matter of fact, if you get this book, you don't have to listen to anything else in this talk. It's all in there. All right, that's all we're going to say about pollinators. Let's move to caterpillars. They are the bread and butter of terrestrial food webs. So they're important. And I say that because caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other insects, as a matter of fact, than any other plant eater. And that is globally. Dan Jansen told us that way back in 1988. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we have failed food webs. And if you have failed food webs, eventually you have failed ecosystems, which is not sustainable. So how do we increase the number of caterpillars in our yards? That's a challenge. It's pretty easy, actually. You add caterpillars to landscapes by adding the plants that make them, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not make a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be choosy about it. We have to pick the ones that do. And we have to be choosy about it because the caterpillars themselves are very fussy about it. And they're fussy about it because the plants have made them fussy. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and turn it into their own growth and reproduction. So they protected their tissues with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those tissues either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense. It keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But insects do eat plants. So how do they do that? This is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat particular plants, plants for which they have developed particular adaptations that allow them to get around those chemical defenses. Particular enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But once they acquire all of those adaptations, they are locked into eating those particular plants. So, for example, if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas, the monarch butterfly is not going to be able to start to develop on your hostas. It's locked into milkweeds, and it has two choices then. can fly away and find milkweed someplace else or starve to death. So this is actually pretty simple. There are 3 kinds of plants out there, and it's useful if we think about each of the plants in our yard to figure out which category they belong to. There are contributors, there are non-contributors, and there are detractors. Contributors are plants that contribute energy to local food webs. And the best example of a contributor in 84% of the counties in which they occur is one of our oaks, contributing more energy than any other type of plant. There are non-contributors. These are plants that are there in the landscape, but nothing eats them, which means the energy that is captured by these plants is not passed up the food chain, up the food web. And ginkgo biloba is a great example of that. Nice ornamental, but nothing eats it. And then finally, we have plants that detract energy from local food webs. And that's any of our invasive ornamentals, things like calorie pear or barberry or buckthorn or autumn olive, all the things we brought over for ornamental use that have now escaped and are aggressively displacing the native plants that do contribute a lot to local food webs. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. We're not going to reconstruct the food webs that support the ecosystems that support us unless we choose the right plants. So for example, if I want to have the Pandora Sphinx in my yard, I need Virginia creeper. That's its host plant. If I want the tulip tree silk moth, I need tulip trees. If I want the Luna moth, I need sweet gum. Now, Luna moths will eat different things as you move around the country, but where I am, it's a specialist on sweet gum. Zebra swallowtail only eats pawpaws. I wanted to have zebra swallowtails in our yard when we moved in, so we planted pawpaws. We had to wait 9 years for the zebra swallowtails to find our pawpaws, but they finally did. Nearest population was 26 miles away, but they finally found it, and now we've got a good population of zebra swallowtails. A lot of things on native grapes. 8-spotted forester moth is just one. If you have viburnums, you can have the green marvel. Goldenrod supports 110 species of caterpillars, things like beautiful caterpillars like the brown-hooded owlet. Even poison ivy supports a lot of specialist caterpillars, like the beautiful Utilia. People say, oh, poison ivy. You know, when you get poison ivy when you try to get rid of it. Don't touch it, and then you won't get poison ivy. You can run faster than it does. This is risk management. We know that roses, for example, have really sharp thorns, so we don't grab them with our hands because that hurts. But that's risk management. We know that poison ivy has leaves that will make us itchy, so don't grab the leaves. Works really well. Sculptured moth, a specialist on persimmon, the Hebrew on black gum, the fawn sphinx on ash, our poor beleaguered ash specialists. All the ash is disappearing because of emerald ash borer. But this is a beautiful category. I call this art in the garden. Rosy maple moth on maples. Maples are wonderful plants. Royal walnut on walnut and hickory, extirpated from New England, probably gone from southern Canada already as well. So insects are disappearing. We've got to make sure that doesn't continue. Double-tooth prominent on elm. These are just examples. There are dozens of species on all of these plants. The witch hazel dagger moth on witch hazel, imperial moth on pines. Even our native clematis supports specialists like the spotted thyrus. Two-toed ancellus on ironwood, lost owlet on buttonbush, the herald on native willows, the snowberry clearwing on coral honeysuckle, which is our native honeysuckle. Evening primrose moth, believe it or not, is on evening primrose. The moth comes and spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded in there, but it's always very cute. Showy emerald on sumac, and I'm not talking about poison sumac. I've never even seen poison sumac. That's a plant of the swamp. I'm talking about staghorn sumac or smooth sumac, wonderful soil stabilization plants, and that's a beautiful moth. Then we have some real powerhouses, things like our native prunus. Will support the white furcula, the crocus geometer, the yayo moth, the cecropia moth, the colorful zale, the tufted bird dropping moth. And I ask you, who wouldn't want the tufted bird dropping moth in their yard? The paddle caterpillar. You know, this is a learning opportunity. Send your kids out and tell them to find a caterpillar on a black cherry, for example, and figure out what those paddles are for. They're not there for decorations. They're there for a reason. And don't tell them what that reason is. And I'm not going to tell you either. I want you to figure it out. It's the same reason that the filament geometer has expandable filaments on its back. These are all on native prunus, things like cherries. Small-eyed sphinx, the Harris's 3-spot, which holds an umbrella of its head capsules over its head. And then if you touch it, it whips around and slaps you with it. It's a defensive mechanism. The snowy shouldered Aclaris, and then oaks, the most powerful of all of our native plants, support all kinds of caterpillars. Things like the hag moth, which thinks it's a tarantula, the red wash prominent, the white dotted prominent, the spiny oak moth, the skiff moth, the white blotched heterocampa, the oak skeletonizer, the solitary oak leaf miner, the orange patch smoky wing, the half oval ancillus, the crown slug. These guys are called slug caterpillars because their head is tucked up underneath. They're not really slugs, they're really caterpillars. The pink striped oak worm. This is my favorite, the spun glass slug caterpillar. It looks just like spun glass, and literally hundreds more species are on oaks. And that's why I call oaks keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. It's a stone in the middle of the Roman arch. And when you take that stone out of the arch, the stone collapses. Well, keystone plants are, if you take them out of your local food web, the food web collapses. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that support that house. They're the support systems. You cannot build an ecological house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last 100 years or so. Now, you're not through building your ecological house when you have your keystone plants, but they're an essential first step. So the best keystone plant in terms of making caterpillars would be one of our oaks. Over 557 species of caterpillars supported in the mid-Atlantic states where I live, over 950 species nationwide, although we are getting ready to expand this number quite a bit with a lot of new host records. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. How do you know what the best plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code in the US, and the ranked list of the best woody plants and herbaceous plants for your county will pop up. It'll look something like this. In southern Canada, you can use, this doesn't extend up into Canada, but you can use a zip code from Buffalo or Erie, Pennsylvania, and come up with a very similar list. Okay, where did I take all the pictures I just showed you? I took them in my yard, and this is what our yard looked like when we moved in. In the year 2000, we got part of a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots. It had been mowed for hay. So really, there was very, very little there. And our goal was to put all those creatures back. This is what it looks like today. And it looks like this because, yes, we put the plants back. Not all of them. I add plants now and then when I get a chance. But my research has shown through the years that a great index of how successful your food web is to count the number of moth species that occur there. Not butterfly species, but moth species. Butterflies are simply day-flying, bad-tasting moths. So birds don't eat. They can fly during the day because they don't taste very good. But the moths do taste good. And if you count the number, then you know how stable and productive your food web is. And that's what I've been doing for the last 5 years, taking pictures of all the moths that I could find on our property. And I'm up to 1,199 species of moths so far. Now we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the land mass, we've recorded 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And they're there because we planted lots of plants. We planted witch hazels and oaks and persimmons and American elms, and all of these guys. And we tolerated plants that people typically get rid of. A lot of people think black cherry's a weed, got to get rid of it. New York fern, for some reason, they don't like it. Native grapes, tulip trees, Virginia creepers got a bad reputation, but I don't know why. These are things that people, poison ivy, greenbrier, dodder, people get rid of all the time, but they all support lots of specialists. And these are just examples of the things we put back. And because we've added so many caterpillars to our yards, we've added the birds that require those caterpillars, particularly when they're breeding. We've added wood thrush. Wood thrush is a bird of the forest. Remember, we started out with it had been mowed for hay, but it's been 22 years now, and we have a young forest going. With Virginia creeper that makes the lettered sphinx, and that's why we've got wood thrush. We've got indigo bunnings because we've got alders that support the ruby quaker. We've got chipping sparrows because we've got black walnut that makes gray edgebow malokas. Field sparrows because we have oaks making red line panapodas. We've got tufted titmice because we've got black cherries making dowdy pinions. Phoebes because we've got lots of native grasses making skippers. We've got robins. Robins eat more than worms. They eat many species of moths that are on those weeds. Most of our native herbaceous plants are called weeds, but they're very productive. We've got chickadees, Carolina chickadees, because we've got tulip trees making tulip tree beauty, white-eyed vireos because we've got spice bush making spice bush swallowtails. We've got house wrens because we've got hickories making copper underwings, and we've got bluebirds because we've got sycamores making drab prominence. We've got 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres because we put the food back. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline that we see quite often. The World Wildlife Fund says that we've lost 2/3 of wildlife on Earth since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I am sure we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. Imagine what would happen if everybody put the plants back. We could really turn many of these terrible headlines around. So by choosing the right plants and by using more of them, we really could restore insects, both caterpillars and pollinators, nearly everywhere. So I'm going to leave you with 9 things that you can do to restore ecosystems in your yard and the food webs that support those all-important insects, starting with our lawns. Now, I know in Canada, you guys are not, you're not guilty of what we're guilty of. We have 44 million acres of lawn in the US, which is an area the size of New England dedicated to an ecological deadscape. And I know why we need that, because lawn is a status symbol and because we need to display our Halloween decorations. But I'm suggesting we cut the area of lawn in half. I've drove past this church in Mississippi several times, and I always think that people are inside worshiping God's creations, and on the outside, they're killing them all with this crazy lawn. We're just not thinking. We want to plant for specialist bees. We talked about that. We want to remove invasive species that are already on our property. A lot of states are banning them. You can't buy them anymore, but they're already there. So look around your property, see if you can identify any, and that includes the edges too, and get rid of them. These are typical invasive species in a lot of places of North America. English ivy, a big one. Calorie pear, huge as you move south. Porcelain berry, getting worse every year. It's the kudzu of the north. Burning bush, terrible. Privet, millions of acres of privet in the south. Chinese elm, glossy buckthorn, amber, bush honeysuckle. I mean, it's a long list. And if you have them in your yard, you definitely want to get rid of them. Use keystone plants. We talked about that. Landscape for caterpillars. We haven't talked about that. What does that mean? Well, this is an example. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. That's a mistake up there. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillars eat the leaves, then they spin a cocoon and hang from one of the branches, and then they emerge as an adult, and then they do it all over again. And I wish everything did that, but most species don't. Most species finish growing as caterpillars on the tree, and then they drop from the tree, and they wiggle their way beneath the soil surface and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree, and that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. Across the country, everywhere you go, this is the typical landscape. Leaf litter is messy. And we mow and compact our soil so that they are rock hard, which makes it really difficult for those caterpillars to get underground. So this becomes an ecological trap. If these are acceptable host plants, the adults will lay their eggs here. The eggs will hatch and develop as caterpillars drop down and die. And I am convinced that the way we landscape is another important source of insect declines around the country. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. Now, this is what most people do. You've got a tree in a yard. I have a new grad student this year, Emma Jonas, who is starting to measure how well caterpillars do in a situation like this. But I guarantee they're going to do better in a layered landscape like this, where you have a tree, maybe a dogwood here, and then a native azalea and ferns and ground cover. This becomes soft landing. The caterpillars drop down. The soil is not compacted. Nobody's going to mow them. Nobody's going to walk on them. They can easily get underground. Or spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under there. Much higher survivorship in a situation like this. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn. Put beds around every tree that you have, big beds, the bigger the better. This all becomes soft landing, safe sites for those caterpillars. The tree will love it. Trees hate grass right up to the trunk. And it'll help those caterpillars a lot. Use the native ground covers liberally, things like wild ginger, May-apples, foamflower, ferns. There's lots of them out there. As a matter of fact, if you can see the ground, you don't have enough plants. Green mulch is the ideal mulch. And again, they're all safe sites for those caterpillars. Reduce light pollution. Light pollution is a major cause of insect declines, particularly the moths that are creating the caterpillars that are running our food web. So when you put the right plants, you put those keystone plants into your yard, you invite a lot of insects to your yard, and then we kill them with our security lights. No good. These are all the ways that lights kill insects at night. But it's actually good news to me. Because we've got to turn around insect declines, not just stop it. We've got to have insect increases. And if we can get there by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. But I know what you're going to say. Well, I can't turn the light out over my barn or over my garage or over my front door because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on your light so that it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to recognize is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, even easier, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. Yellow incandescent or yellow LED, both are available. If we were to switch out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects. And if you use LEDs, millions of dollars too, because they're certainly much more energy efficient. Oppose mosquito spraying. This is a booming business certainly in the US. Mosquito fogging. And companies like Mosquito Joe will tell you this is okay because what they're fogging is a natural product, and it is. It's pyrethroids. That's the compound found in chrysanthemums, which evolved to kill insects. It's industrial strength pyrethroids, but they say it's a natural product, and as if that makes it okay. Cyanide is a natural product too, but it doesn't make it okay. They also say it only kills mosquitoes, and that's not even close to true. It kills all of the insects it comes in contact with, including monarchs. Big monarch killed 2 years ago when they flew through Mosquito Joe, hundreds of dead monarchs on the ground. The interesting thing is it does not control mosquitoes. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. It's too hard. You have to kill 90% of them to get control in the adult stage. Mosquito Joe kills between 10 and 50%. So it's much better to control them with biocontrol using mosquito dunks. We'll talk about that in a second. And also, no more bug zappers. They zap bugs, but they're not the right ones. We did a study way back in 1996, 99.98% of the insects killed by bug zappers are not mosquitoes. They are not biting flies. They are non-targets. Many of them, midges, look like mosquitoes, but they're not mosquitoes. So you're spending a lot of time killing the insects that run our ecosystems. So here's a viable alternative. Mosquito dunks, it's biocontrol using Bacillus thuringiensis. You go to the hardware store and you buy a sheet of mosquito dunks. And then you get a bucket, you fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay or maybe dead grass and put it out in the sun for a couple of days and let populations of algae and diatoms build up in your bucket. That becomes an irresistible brew to ovipositing mosquitoes. The females will lay their eggs in your bucket. Then you throw in a mosquito dunk, the eggs hatch, the larvae chew on it, and they die. It's extremely targeted. This formulation of Bacillus thuringiensis only kills aquatic diptera, and the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito larva. So if a dragonfly gets in there, it won't hurt it at all. If your dog drinks it, no problem. You might put a coarse screen over it so your local chipmunk doesn't commit suicide, but otherwise it's targeted, it's cheap. What's this cost? $12, something like that. And it works, and you don't kill anything else. But here's something that I haven't tried, but you can buy it, a mosquito racket. I think there's batteries in here and it's electrified. So if you're outside and things are buzzing around your head, just swing a racket at it and then you'll get those mosquitoes. But a fan works as well. Excuse me. Turn it on. It creates enough wind, enough directed flow that the mosquitoes can't fly into it. So without killing anything, you can actually enjoy your backyard. Minimize insecticide use overall. You know, if you go to the hardware store and you look at the shelves of insecticides, it's just lined with them. Homeowners use a tremendous amount of insecticide, and all of them are unnecessary, with the exception of termite control. That's about it. That's about it. So no bug zappers. We talked about that. And then finally, a lot of people say that, well, I can't do the things you suggest because my homeowners association, my civic association has these rules, and I can't do that. I can't reduce my lawn. I can't use native plants, and so on and so forth. So join your HOA, infiltrate. Let's change from within. Rather than complaining about the rules, join them, explain that their rules are outdated. They were formulated mostly in the 70s to keep us from having rusty cars in our front yards. But then they went crazy with landscaping rules. And because there's so much land in residential landscapes now, it's a ecological disaster. So let's change those rules. And you know what? I'm getting emails from people who've done this. They've joined their HOA. They say it works. It works. So that's great. We're going to loosen up those rules. And by the way, there was a lawsuit in the state of Maryland where an HOA told a man he wasn't allowed to use certain native plants. So he challenged it in court and he won. So now there's there's a precedent. There's a legal precedent. So these rules are going to lighten up. All right, let's end the talk the way we started it, with E.O. Wilson. One of the things that was consistent throughout his very long career was his love of biodiversity, his love of life on Earth. He loved it, but he also knew it was essential for our own survival. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functional ecosystems on at least half of the planet. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't tell us how we were going to actually do that. Well, to a conservation biologist, it's great news. We'll just put half the Earth aside and everything will be great. But remember, half the Earth is already in some form of agriculture. We've got 8 billion people in the other half, along with all of our houses and airports and detritus. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we actually do that? Well, I think we can realize Wilson's dream, but we need a new approach to conservation. And that's the approach that we just talked about. We have to give up the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist. In the past, we've had this idea that humans are here and nature's someplace else. We now have to embrace the fact that we have to be in the same place. We don't have the third half of the Earth. We can coexist in the same time at the same place. And I hope I've given you enough examples to prove that that is so. It doesn't mean that you have to save insects, you have to save nature for a living, but you can save them where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. You know, more and more people are recognizing the Earth has some serious problems now, but they all feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can fire Mosquito Joe, one person can put in a pollinator garden, one person can use keystone plants, one person can modify their lights. There's all kinds of things that one person can do that will change the ecological functionality of their own property. And it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You'll get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They are all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So insect decline is a global problem, but it has a grassroots solution. It's one that every one of us, you and me, everybody, can contribute to. We created this problem. We really can solve it. So thank you. But before I turn it over, I want to talk a little bit about the Homegrown National Park Initiative that we've started, a small nonprofit. And the goal is to get the message that we are all an important part of the future of conservation. Get that message to all the people who don't know that. Get that message to go viral. It's free. The object is to register your property on the map. And now Canada has joined it. So we have expanded to include Canada. You put in your location, the amount of area that you're being a good steward of. So maybe you are reducing your lawn, maybe you're planting an oak tree, maybe you're putting an aster in a flower pot. Anything that you do, that area will go on the map, and your little piece of where you live will light up. And the object is to get the whole country to light up. We are asking that people reduce the area in lawn. We want them to plant more natives, remove the invasives that are already on their property, and protect any natural areas that they might own. And there's two products. There's ecological product, which is going to create significant increases in biodiversity. It works. We've already talked about that. But all the plants we put in our property are going to create a significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. We're pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, tying it up in these plants, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground. So Homegrown National Park will encourage people to help climate change as well. And that map will allow us to observe the creation of biological corridors, building connections between existing preserves. Our sociological product, which is just as important, is national awareness, not just of what the problem is, but what the solutions are. We want to change the culture. We've got an adversarial relationship with nature right now. We want it to be a collaborative one. We want people to recognize that nature is not optional and that everybody has a responsibility to sustaining it because everybody needs it. And that map will provide measurable progress towards the UN's 30-30 initiative. We're going to save 30% of the earth by 2030. Benefits of Homegrown National Park: it converts hope into action. You know, we can hope all we want, but if we don't take action, it's not going to work. We don't rely on any governmental support. We would love governmental support, but we're not going to fold if it doesn't happen. And it merges all of the national conservation efforts that already exist. Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones. They're all doing wonderful work, but because we do not charge, there's no membership fee. We're not pulling members away. We're simply going to record all of the successful conservation that these folks are doing in one aspirational visual, the map. Thanks very much.
Okay, I'm back, Doug.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation, as we expected, and we're so glad that you took the time to talk to our community. We're still at high numbers of participation, and we're still really overwhelmed. Speaking to that, looking at our participation list for seeing an amazing list, she'll be giving a webinar with us called Pollinator Palooza in March, on March 7th, I believe. So what's all the buzz about? That'll be exciting. I'm sure a lot of you, if not all of you here, will enjoy that just as much as we enjoyed Doug's presentation. Okay, Doug, back to you. We have a lot of questions in the bank. Are you ready for me to start reading them out to you?
We'll see.
We'll
Yes.
see.
Give it
Oh my gosh, I got 5 more while I was talking.
Don't
Okay,
talk in.
All right, so I'm going to go in order. We started getting them pretty early in the presentation. Let's see, Virginia. She is an avid native plant gardener in Staten Island, New York. What are the top 3 native ground covers that you recommend for their backyards?
I also recommend them for their front yards. That's just one of my pet peeves. If we talk about backyard habitat, it suggests it's so ugly we have to hide it in the backyard, and that's not true. We can have ground covers in the front too. There's a lot of them. If you don't have a lot of deer pressure, native Pachysandra is great. Virginia creeper is a great ground cover, believe it or not. A mixture. It does not have to be one species. So foam flower, May apples, wild ginger, any of the spring ephemerals, all mixed together. Bloodroot, bloodroot blooms in the spring, but the foliage remains the rest of the summer. So there are a lot of examples. If you get the living landscape and look in the back, there are lists of plants in different regions that have different ecological functions, including ground covers there. Or you can just simply Google ground covers in Staten Island. A whole bunch will pop up, but make sure they are are native. Don't do no vinca, none of these other things.
All
Yes,
right.
wild strawberry makes a good ground cover too. Yes.
Okay, next one is from Nina. Considering climate change, will planting near native host plants be beneficial?
Near native. You mean if we move things up from the south? That's what I hear all the time. Assisted migration. So if we take a plant from down south and plant it up north, thinking that the planet's going to get warmer over time. Years ago, we had a cold snap that went all the way down in Mexico. Froze Texas out. That's not the last one of those. So we call them polar, vortices south. They're going to get nailed during.
This meeting is being recorded.
The best way to do that is to minimize the use of cultivars which have zero genetic variability. You want the straight species with as much genetic variability as possible, because that is the stuff that adaptation works with. That's how natural selection works. So I'm not a big fan of assisted migration.
I hadn't heard that point before. That was really interesting. Okay, the next one is moving on to the topic of wasps.
Somebody just explained what near native, what they were talking about. They're talking about cultivars. And cultivars has nothing to do with climate change. That's accentuating a particular trait that we happen to like. It's usually an aesthetic trait. These are big questions. Everybody wants to know whether cultivars are the ecological equivalent of the straight species that they come from. And the answer is it depends. It depends on what the trait was. If you take a green leaf and you make it red or purple, you've ruined its use for leaf eaters, because you've loaded the leaf with anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. But if you take a tall plant, make it short, the insects don't seem to care. A lot of cultivars focus on changing flower structure and color and shape and so on. We make an echinacea look like a zinnia. Again, zero genetic variability, so that's not great. But the chances that you are messing up a specialized interaction with specialist bees when you fool with flower traits is quite high. So, but not always. I mean, there's a phlox divaricated or paniculated genna that has twice as many flowers and therefore twice as many pollinators. So it's not black and white. All cultivars aren't bad, but they're not all good either. So you can see right away whether it's doing the job that you wanted it to in your yard.
That's a good point. Yeah. Okay, so from Victoria. Do wasps have strong ecological value as well, despite their propensity to sting people?
Well, they do. They're predators. Now, unfortunately, a lot of them are predators on my caterpillars, and I don't like that. But that's what keeps things under control. People always worry, you're going to have a caterpillar outbreak, and it's going to eat all my plants. Wasps are eating caterpillars every single day, so they are part of the system, and we need to tolerate the plants, the things that eat plants, and the things that eat those plant eaters. And there's usually several layers of that. And we always think of birds and other things eating insects, and they eat a ton, but it's other insects that are eating insects that provide the primary means of control, mostly tiny little parasitoids that lay their eggs inside insects. So wasps are necessary, even if we don't like them.
Okay, next one's about hoverflies. Are hoverflies parasitical, wasps pollinators?
Hoverflies are flies. They're not parasites. They're in the family Syrphidae. No, they're just fine.
Okay. Got one.
They're harmless, by the way. They look like bees. They're mimicking yellow jackets, and some mimic bumblebees, but they don't sting. They're totally harmless.
No,
You can amaze your friend by catching one of the big species that look like yellow jackets. Pretend it's stinging you, because it'll sound like it is, but it won't hurt at all.
That's awesome. Next one's from Stuart. Hey, Stuart. Do you think offsetting is a viable option for habitat loss due to development? For context, the Ontario government has put out a discussion paper on conserving Ontario's natural heritage that's open to comments until December 30th. That's for everyone in Ontario.
I don't know the details of offsetting, but if you're talking about preserving, if you're going to wreck one place, you're going to preserve another place
so offsetting is creating, oh, sorry, I got another question. It jumped me down. Offsetting is creating new ecosystems to offset or compensate for those removed due to development.
You preserve an existing one, I'm all for it. Mitigation, where you're moving a wetland and creating a new wetland, that's better than nothing, but it usually is not nearly as good as what you destroyed, particularly when you're talking about wetlands, because most of the things that use wetlands have a terrestrial phase. So for example, the salamanders and the toads and the frogs, and if you don't preserve a lot of land around that wetland, you've lost all of those things. And most of the time that is not preserved. So if you're saving something that's intact and say, okay, we're going to permanently protect this because we're wrecking another area, sure, that's much better than not doing it. But it'd be great to recognize that the earth has limits. It's not growing. We can't grow forever. We can't develop forever. The word sustainable development makes no sense at all, because there are limits to development, and we passed them a long time ago. That's what I'd like to see happen, is actually get control of our growth.
Yeah, us too. Okay, next one's from Victoria. Do cultivars of native plants provide the same benefits to specialists?
Well, that's what I tried to answer a few minutes
Yeah,
ago.
you did, right? Okay.
So the answer is it depends. Sometimes yes, a lot of times no.
Okay, so I'll make sure. Maybe you can do this after, but repeat the NWF website. Someone was just asking if you could.
Native Plant Finder.
Native Plant Finder. Okay.
Just put Native Plant Finder in and it'll pop up.
Great. Okay, Jane. Hey, Jane. What plants that are edible to us are also best for pollinators? We have a large food garden, mostly herbs and berries.
It depends on your definition of pollinators. If you're really talking about bees and things, a lot of our edible plants aren't great for that. But pawpaws are edible. The nuts are hickories. Hickories are great plants, by the way. They support a lot of muzz that then turn into nighttime pollinators. Well, let's see, what else do we eat? Apples, malus. That's not a native plant, but we do have native crab apples. They're good plants. That's a lousy answer to that question. We should move on.
Done. Okay. The next one's from Nina. How do you get rid of Japanese beetles?
Well, Japanese beetles, one of those non-native insects. And by the way, when I say we want insects, we do not want non-native insects. They all cause trouble, from the spongy moth, used to be gypsy moth, to the emerald ash borer, the hemlock woolly adelgid, the Japanese beetle. Big long list, causing tremendous issues. Japanese beetles, as adults, eat a lot of different things, so they're generalists. But as larvae, they're specialists on grass. So if you really want to control Japanese beetles, you minimize the amount of grass roots that you have. That's what they eat, roots. They can fly a good distance, so you probably have to knock out your neighbor's grass as well. That's why they're tough to control. We've got grass everywhere, but that's what's generating our Japanese beetles.
Let's see. I'm just going to skip down because I saw a question that was very similar. It was on the previously known gypsy moths, asking if there's ecological value to them, I guess, here as opposed to natively.
Yellow-bill and black-bill cuckoos, two species of birds, specialize on hairy caterpillars, including gypsy moth. So they're happy that they're here, but boy, that's not worth it. We don't want You got to call them spongy moth now.
Yeah.
No, terrible day when we brought them over. So
Okay, moving on to mosquitoes, your mosquito topic. How do you dispose of the water in the mosquito dunk pail?
dump it. Remember, it's not toxic to anything except aquatic diptera. So it's not, doesn't hurt you. You could actually drink it. You won't like it, but it is not toxic.
Perfect. So the next one is mosquitoes provide food for insects and several varieties of bats. Isn't it best to allow most mosquitoes to live?
Yes, for our native mosquitoes, but a lot of the ones causing trouble and annoyance to us are non-native. They're invasive species too, like Aedes aegypti and the Asian tiger mosquito. So we've got a lot of native mosquitoes. And yes, particularly as you move north into the wetlands of Canada, mosquitoes are a very important component of aquatic ecosystems. We're just trying to keep people from fogging the world, trying to control mosquitoes. And that's typically in the dense, suburban, urban areas. A lot of times the mosquitoes that are causing troubles where we live are in sewer drains. So even when it's not raining, there's often a little bit of water down there, and that generates a lot of mosquitoes sometimes. So throwing a dunk down there would be okay. I am not worried about eliminating the mosquito populations. There are a lot of them out there. So.
Okay, let's see. Every time there's a question that pops in, it drags to the bottom, so I gotta catch myself. Okay, from Rob, are there any species of plants that are helpful for overwintering insects? Dropped again, sorry.
Yeah.
For instance, I've repeatedly found native ladybugs under plants with leaves that touch the ground, such as foxglove and vipers, bug loss when digging in the garden in the fall.
It's usually not species of plants, it's structure. A lot about when insects overwinter in rotting logs. It's another benefit of that coarse woody debris we talked about laying around the property. The insects love that. Those native bees that overwinter in the dead stems of many of our meadow plants, that's an important component. And it's not just that's just bees, but meadow katydids lay their eggs in those stems. So a lot of people say, when can I burn my meadow, or when can I mow it without killing anything? And the answer is never. That stuff that looks dead is loaded with life, which is why we recommend that you mow or burn a third of your meadow area or your prairie area each year, so that any 1 year, 2/3 are untouched. And then what you mow or burn will be colonized when it grows back by the 2/3 that were untouched. And if you have woodies moving in very rapidly, then spot treat them, as opposed to, you're never going to control woody invasives like autumn olive by mowing. All you do is set it back, and the root system will produce a big plant really, really fast as soon as you stop mowing. So it's much better to get rid of it than repeated mowing.
Okay, great. Let's see. This one's about the composition of your garden. So should native plants be planted in groups of the same type or scattered amongst each other?
Yeah, great question. And again, it depends. In general, massing is a good idea. If you're planting for pollinators, you want to make it easy on the pollinators. You don't want to make them fly a long distance to get to the next plant of that particular species. So having a mass of flowers in one place means they can go very quickly from flower to flower and get a lot of a lot of pollen and a lot of nectar with very little energy. So that's good. People plant milkweed for monarchs, but they'll put in one milkweed stalk. I can't tell you how many times I got an email saying I planted a milkweed and worms got on it, so I squished them. The worms, of course, are my milkweed or monarch caterpillars. You want to make a milkweed patch where there's enough ramets so that monarchs can oviposit there, and there'll be enough foliage so the caterpillars can complete their development. If you're planting oak trees and you want them to make acorns, they can't self-fertilize. So you need more than one individual of a species so that pollen can transfer. So in general, more than one is good.
Sounds like what we do, Aileen. Okay, let me see who's next.
Nikki, there was one just at the top from an anonymous person. Have other wildlife, other than the birds, birds are the best though, have they visited your property now as well after the 20 years?
Oh, yes. We have raccoons, foxes, possums, mink, gray tree frogs, 7 species of snakes, and all the things that I forget, but they're here. There are a lot of insects out there besides caterpillars that I'm not talking about. Hundreds and hundreds of species that come in as well. So, but the fun vertebrates, those are the things we'd like. We certainly have squirrels and deer. We got plenty of deer, but yes, things come in right away.
Awesome. Thanks for catching that, Aileen. Okay. So Annie made a comment. So the other places that we have registered our gardens will transfer over to the Homegrown National Park in Canada. That is a great idea. So thank you for sharing. I know a few people or everyone probably appreciated it.
Every acre that you guys are preserving should be on that map.
It's amazing.
Good.
All right.
Serena,
Talking about
we add
the
that to your list.
What's that?
I said we'll add that to Serena's to-do list to get all our acreage on that map.
Hey,
Will
you can do it in 5
All right.
minutes. It's easy.
Awesome. All right.
Oh my goodness, we have so many awesome questions. I don't know if we'll get through them all, but we'll take a few more. So, let's see. Oh, Janet is next. The rusty patch bumblebee is extinct in Canada. How is the U.S. endangered species doing currently?
Boy, ask Lorraine when she talks in March. I don't know what the latest is. There are sightings here and there, small little populations, not doing well, but it's not extinct yet. It's one of these species that probably has succumbed to a disease that we brought over with commercial bumblebees from Europe. So the populations that people are seeing now, the hope is that they actually have some resistance. If they don't, there's not much hope for them. But every once in a while, somebody sees one. So,
yeah, that's a story. Next one's a good thing for everybody to know. Is there any consideration on how to dispose of removed non-native plants?
it depends on the species, but something like Japanese knotweed, a piece the size of your pinky nail can start a new plant. So cutting it down and just throwing it out there is probably not a good idea. You want to put it in a place where it's going to die, but it can be hard. We had a lot of autumn olive when we moved into our property, and I cut down many of them and stacked them up. I was going to use them for stakes for deer cages in the fall. So I cut them down in the summer and they just laid there all summer long. Then in the fall, I pounded them in to hold up my deer stakes and they all rooted. This was after laying there with nothing on them for the whole summer. So they're tough plants. On the other hand, things like multiflora rose and Oriental bittersweet, you cut them down, they decompose very, very quickly. So be aware if you're cutting down when they're full of seed, those seeds can be viable and they'll spread. But there's no secret to it. I guess burning it is a good idea, but.
Okay. Let's see. So this was related to being near native. So that earlier question, I think that we had. I mean, plants that are naturally occurring in Upper New York and not in Ottawa, such as Echinacea. Why can't I say that?
Yeah.
So, back to assisted migration, if they're right on the edge, it's probably okay. it's probably okay. You're not moving them beyond the reach of the things that use them. But if you're talking about moving them hundreds of miles, then you probably are moving them beyond the reach of the things that use them, and in which case they're going to be just like a non-native plant. So.
Okay, we're at 8:30 now. I don't think we'll get through all of these questions in the next few minutes. I'm going to suggest that if anybody wants to follow up, to send us an email. Aileen, would you prefer your email or outreach?
You an email, yes.
We can try to answer them. I'm just seeing a lot of great chat come in and lots of great questions. I know we're not going to get to all of them tonight, but I mean, everyone's been participating in such a great way and been so engaged. You've been all a really great audience. Aileen, did you want to say something?
Wow. Thank you, Doug. I've been, promoting and working with native plants for a very long time, and this was fabulous. I learned so much. Thank you so much for this. Some great recommendations. There's some great questions still. I might try to answer them afterwards. Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody that came. I saw some of our wonderful volunteers and supporters and board members, and even my aunt from Ottawa, hi Auntie Helen, that were in the crowd. So thanks to everybody for coming out, and I hope everybody's inspired to go and make just even a little difference, a big difference. It's not hard, and I think, Doug, thank you so much for giving us hope and easy things that we can do moving forward. So I hope everybody's inspired to make a change. And we really need it right now. Speak up. You can do it at home. You can come help us. We're creating pollinator gardens. If you're in a condo, there's lots of things you can do, and if everyone does something, we can make change.
Okay. Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Awesome.
Take care.
All right. So thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.